I am Chittibabu, Vikas Global Institutions, Jengareddygudem. I will give one information about the Vikas Global Institutions. It is one of the only one college in the Jengareddygudem for IIT NEET MCET Academy permitted college in Jengareddygudem. It is one of the college in the Jengareddygudem, IIT NEET MCET Academy permitted college. That is the Vikas Global Institutions, Jengareddygudem. So now I will enter into the classes, chemistry class. So last class I was discussed about the van der Waals equation state. Last class I was discussed about the van der Waals equation state. What is the van der Waals equation? There is the P plus an square by v square into v minus nb equal to nRT. In the ideal gas equation, what is the ideal gas equation? That is the PV is equal to nRT. This is the ideal gas equation. PV is equal to nRT. So according to van der Waals, he arised two corrections, that is a pressure correction and volume corrections. Pressure and volume corrections are arranged in the ideal gas equation, that is the PV is equal to nRT. That is the van der Waals equation is P plus an square by v square into v minus nb is equal to nRT. Okay. Here the pressure correction is the pressure correction, that is P plus an square by v square, and volume correction is the v minus nb. Substitute these two values in the ideal gas equation, we get the van der Waals equation, that is P plus an square by v square into v minus nb is equal to nRT. Here A and B are, what are the A and B? Here A and B are van der Waals constants or van der Waals parameters. So here A and B are called van der Waals parameters or van der Waals constants. So what about the A, what about the B? Here the A and B both are depends upon the nature of the gas. Here both A and B are depends upon the nature of the gas, depends on the nature of gas and independent of temperature. Independent of the temperature. What is the significance? Next one in Japkunam. What is the significances of the A and B? So what is the meaning of A and B? Van der Waals constants or van der Waals parameters. So what is the significance of A? A is measure the force of attraction between the molecules. It measures the force of attraction between the molecules, and A increases. A is the gas. A gas molecule increases the A. It is liquefied. Okay. So what is the A? It measures the force of attraction between the molecules. A gas, A value increases, it is liquefied. So what is about the B? It is effective size on the molecule. B increases, the size also increases. That is the significances of the van der Waals constant. That is the last class. Now I will discuss about the intermolecular forces. Intermolecular forces. Intermolecular forces. So intermolecular forces అర్థం కావాలంటే మనకు ఒక 3 definitions అర్థమై ఉండాలి. ఏంటి ఆ definitions? What is meant by non-polar molecules? What is meant by non-polar? What is meant by polar? What is meant by polar molecules? And what is meant by dipole moment? Dipole moment. ఈ 3 definitions అర్థమవుతాయి మనకి ఇంటర్మాలిక్యులర్ ఫోర్సెస్లో ఉన్న కొన్ని కాన్సెప్ట్స్, టైప్స్ ఆఫ్ ఇంటర్మాలిక్యులర్ ఫోర్సెస్ అనేవి ఈజీగా అర్థమవుతాయి. సో వాట్ ఈస్ ద నాన్ పోలార్ మాలిక్యూల్? హియర్ దట్ ఎనీ మాలిక్యూల్ హ్యావింగ్ ద నో చార్జ్ ఇన్ ఎనీ ఆటమ్ ఇన్ ఏ మాలిక్యూల్. ఒక మాలిక్యూల్ తీసుకుంటే ఆ మాలిక్యూల్ ఉన్నటువంటి ఆటమ్స్ అనే వాటికి నో చార్జ్ అని తెలియకపోతే వాటిని ఏమంటారు? నాన్ పోలార్ మాలిక్యూల్స్. క్లియర్? వాట్ ఈస్ ద మీనింగ్ ఆఫ్ నాన్ పోలార్ మాలిక్యూల్స్? వాట్ ఈస్ ద మీనింగ్ ఆఫ్ నాన్ పోలార్ మాలిక్యూల్స్? The polar, so what is the meaning of non-polar molecules? No charge in any atom in a molecule is called non-polar molecules. So what are the examples of the non-polar molecules? Examples are CH4, BF3, N2, O2. These are the examples of the non-polar molecules. So what is meant by non-polar molecules? There is no charge on any atom in a molecule is called non-polar molecules. So now what non-polar molecule, simply non-polar molecule means no charge of the atoms or molecule. Okay. And next one, what is meant by polar molecule? That is the reverse of the non-polar molecule. So what is the reverse? Here the having charge in atom in a molecule is called polar molecules. What are the examples of the polar molecules? H2O. How H2O? It is a H2O molecule. It is a partial negative charge. It is a positive charges. Okay. Okay, Nana. And next one, HF. The negative charge, and this is the positive charge. Okay. And next one, HCl. Okay, and O3. Okay, these are the examples of the polar molecules. So what is meant by polar molecules? Having charge in any atom in a molecule is called polar molecules. But non-polar molecules, there is no charge in an atom in a molecule is called non-polar molecules. Examples H4, BF3, N2O2, and polar molecules examples H2O, O3, HF, HCl. These are the polar molecules. But what is meant by dipole moment? So dipole moment means the poles between the distance. Rendu poles major, for example, plus and minus. The distance between the two poles. The magnitude of the charge of the polar molecules, magnitude of the charge and polar molecules, the distance between the two poles. Simply the distance between the two poles. Okay, that means one partial positive charge and negative charge. Rendu charges major. Simply charge separation is called dipole moment. Simply charge separation. Okay, simply charge separation is called dipole moment. The distance between the two poles is called dipole moment, or the magnitude of the charge and between the distance between the two polar molecules is called dipole moment. It is represented by the mu. How it is represented? The dipole moment is represented by the mu. This is the dipole moment. Clear? Non-polar molecules, polar molecules, dipole moments. Non-polar molecule, there is no charge on in atom any molecule is called non-polar molecule. CH4, BF3, N2O2 examples. And the polar molecules means having charge in an atom in a molecule is called polar molecules. And the dipole moment, what is the dipole moment? Simply charge separation. Charge separation is called dipole moment. It is represented by the mu. A distance between the two poles is called dipole moment. Clear? And next one. Now enter into the intermolecular forces. Intermolecular force. So what is meant by intermolecular forces? Already I was told about intermolecular, but it is briefly in the separate topic in the states of matter. Intermolecular forces. What is the intermolecular forces? It is the force of attraction or repulsions between the attracting molecules or interacting molecules like atoms or molecules. Rendu atoms madhya lebothe rendu molecules madhya unnatuvanti attractions ni repulsions ni unna forces ni emantarante intermolecular forces. The forces of attraction and repulsions between the atoms or molecules is called intermolecular forces. The forces of attraction or repulsions between the atoms or molecules or interacting molecules is called intermolecular forces. The attracting intermolecular forces is called van der Waals forces. What is meant by van der Waals forces? ఈ intermolecular forces మధ్య అట్రాక్షన్ ఎక్కువగా ఉంటే వాటిని ఏమంటారంటే van der Waals forces. So what is meant by intermolecular forces? What is meant by van der Waals forces? The intermolecular forces, the forces of attraction or repulsions between the interacting molecules like atoms or molecules is called intermolecular forces. The attracting intermolecular forces is called van der Waals forces. Here the types of intermolecular forces. Types of intermolecular forces. What are the types of intermolecular forces? Number 1, London forces. Number 1, London forces, or it is also called dispersion forces. London forces or dispersion forces. What is meant by London forces or dispersion forces? And another types are there. That is a dipole forces, dipole induced dipole forces, ion dipole forces, ion induced dipole forces. We are having the 5 types in the intermolecular forces. The first one is the London forces. What is meant by London forces? Here the London forces means the intermolecular forces between intermolecular forces between non-polar molecules. Between non-polar molecules. రెండు నాన్ పోలార్ మాలిక్యూల్స్ మధ్య ఉన్నటువంటి అట్రాక్షన్ నే ఫోర్సెస్ నే ఏమంటారు? లండన్ ఫోర్సెస్. That concept of the dispersion forces or London forces introduced by the German physicist that is a London. Okay, so introduced by the London, so it is called London forces. German physicist introduce చేసింది ఎవరన్నా? German physicist. అతని పేరు ఫ్రిడ్జ్ లండన్. So his name Fritz London. So it is called London forces. London forces. So what is meant by London forces? The intermolecular forces between non-polar molecules. రెండు నాన్ పోలార్ మాలిక్యూల్స్ తీసుకుంటే ఆ నాన్ పోలార్ మాలిక్యూల్స్ మధ్య ఉన్నటువంటి ఫోర్సెస్ ఏమంటారంటే లండన్ ఫోర్సెస్ అంటారు. రెండు నాన్ పోలార్ మాలిక్యూల్స్ మధ్య ఉన్నటువంటి ఫోర్సెస్ ఏమంటారు? లండన్ ఫోర్సెస్ అంటారు. Here the London forces are very weak forces. London forces are very weak intermolecular forces. Very weak intermolecular forces. It forms the instantaneous dipoles. How to form the instantaneous dipoles? For example, we take the two non-polar molecules. Will interact with each other to form charge clouds. This is a charge cloud. So positive and positive. To form the instantaneous dipoles. This is the instantaneous dipoles. The force of attraction between the two non-polar molecules. It forms the instantaneous dipole, but not a dipole moment. Instantaneous dipole moment. What is meant by dipole moment? So dipole moment is a charge separation. Simply charge separation. A distance between the two poles. రెండు poles మధ్య distance రెండు charges separation చేయడాన్ని ఏమంటాం? dipole moment అంటాం. ఇక్కడ in the non-polar molecule there is no charge. But in the non-polar molecules will interact with each other to form the instantaneous dipole, like a dipole, not a dipole. Dipole laga act చేస్తుంది. That is called instantaneous dipoles. It forms the instantaneous dipoles. Like a dipole, not dipole. Completely not dipole. It is like acts as a dipole. Dipole laga act చేస్తుంది. మనందరం హీరోస్ కాదు, but acts as a heroes. Okay, Nana. So either take the two non-polar molecules will interact with each other to form the instantaneous dipole. For example, CH4. It is called London forces or dispersion forces. So what is meant by London forces or dispersion forces? The intermolecular forces between the non-polar molecules is called London or dispersion forces. These forces are introduced by the German physicist Fritz London. So it is called London forces. Here the London forces are very weak intermolecular forces. Here the two non-polar molecules will interact with each other to form the instantaneous dipoles. Example CH4. All London forces present in the any molecules, but non-polar have only London forces. Clear that point? What is that point? All London forces present in the molecules, but a non-polar molecule will have only London forces. అన్ని లండన్ ఫోర్సెస్ మాలిక్యూల్స్లో ఉంటాయి, అన్ని మాలిక్యూల్స్లో ఉంటాయి, బట్ నాన్ పోలార్ మాలిక్యూల్స్ మట్ ఎగ్జిబిట్ ఓన్లీ లండన్ ఫోర్సెస్. క్లియర్ నాన్న? అండ్ నెక్స్ట్ వన్ క్లియర్. అండ్ నెక్స్ట్ వన్ second one is dipole forces. Dipole forces. Here then the London forces involve non-polar molecules. Here the dipole forces involve polar molecules. What is the meaning of the dipole forces? It is the interactions, intermolecular forces between the polar molecules, or ఇంకేం చెప్పుకోవచ్చు అంటే the interaction between the two dipole molecules మధ్య interactions ఏమంటారు? రెండు dipole molecules మధ్య ఉన్నటువంటి interactions ని ఏమంటారంటే dipole forces. Clear nana? So what is meant by dipole forces? The interactions between the intermolecular forces between the polar molecules is called dipole forces. One dipole interact with the another dipole. One dipole ఏం చేస్తుంది? ఇంకొక dipole తో interact అవుతుంది. దాన్ని ఏమంటాం? dipole forces. Or the interactions between the two dipole molecules is called dipole forces. For example, the force of attraction between the polar molecules which a partial positive charge and negative charge interact to each other to form permanent dipole moment. But in the London forces, it formed the only instantaneous dipoles. Why it formed the permanent dipole moment? Because either take the two molecules as same polar molecules, it having the charge. The polar molecules having the charge, the polar molecules form the permanent dipole moment. Clear? So for example HCl, it having the dipole moment, it having the positive and negative charges. We take the two polar molecules HCl and interact with the next polar molecule HCl, interact with the third polar molecule HCl. It having the positive charge, it having the negative charge. It having the positive charge, it having the negative charge. It having the positive charge, it having the negative charge. Okay. In the polar molecule, one atom is the chlorine and second polar molecule having the hydrogen interact with each other to form dipole forces. That is called to form the permanent dipole moment. Clear? That is the dipole forces. So what is meant by dipole forces? The intermolecular forces between the polar molecules which having the partial positive charge, one molecule having the positive charge, one molecule having the negative charge. The distance between these two charges is form the permanent dipole moment, is called dipole forces. Simply the definition of the dipole forces: the intermolecular forces between the polar molecules. One polar molecule interact with another polar molecule is called dipole forces, or the interactions between the two dipolar molecules is called dipole forces. In the two dipole molecules, we take the two dipole molecules, one molecule having the negative charge and the second molecule having the positive charge will interact with each other to form the permanent dipole moment. That is called dipole forces. Clear? And third one dipole induced dipole, dipole induced dipole forces. What is meant by dipole induced dipole? So here dipole induced dipole means here the London forces non-polar molecules and the dipole forces is polar molecules, whereas in the dipole induced dipole forces is the interactions between the polar, one polar and second one is the non-polar molecule. ఒక పోలార్ మాలిక్యూల్కి ఇంకొక నాన్ పోలార్ మాలిక్యూల్ మధ్య ఉన్న ఇంటరాక్షన్స్ ఏమంటారంటే డైపోల్ ఇండ్యూస్డ్ డైపోల్ ఫోర్సెస్ అంటారు. బట్ ఇన్ ద లండన్ ఫోర్స్ ఇన్వాల్వ్ ఓన్లీ నాన్ పోలార్ మాలిక్యూల్స్ అండ్ ద డైపోల్ ఫోర్స్ ఇన్వాల్వ్ ఓన్లీ పోలార్ మాలిక్యూల్స్, బట్ ద డైపోల్ ఇండ్యూస్డ్ డైపోల్ వన్ మాలిక్యూల్ is the polar and second one is the non-polar molecule. The intermolecular forces between the polar and the non-polar molecule is called in dipole induced dipole forces. Here the polar molecule having the permanent dipole moment. Here the non-polar molecule is a zero dipole moment. Zero dipole moment. Clear? It can involve a polar molecule having the permanent dipole moment, but here the non-polar molecule is zero dipole moment. One polar molecule interact with, listen, what is the conclusion about the dipole induced dipole? We take the one polar molecule, okay, having the positive charge and negative charge, and the non-polar molecule there is no charge. We take the polar molecule AB, this is the polar molecule, and C, this is the non-polar molecule. For example, we take the polar molecule AB and non-polar molecule C, either having charge positive and negative charge. Here there is no charge. Will interact to each other. Will interact the polar and non-polar molecule. Polar and non-polar molecule. Then this polar molecule influenced by the non-polar molecule. ఏమవుతుంది non-polar molecule polar molecule చేత influence చేయబడి that non-polar molecule gain the partial positive charge and partial negative charge. Will gain positive and negative charges, partial positive and negative charges, and the non-polar molecule will convert the polar molecule not permanently. Polar molecule ఈ non-polar molecule ఏమవుతుంది ఈ polar molecule చేత attract చేయబడి it gains that non-polar molecule will gain the partial positive and negative charges, and finally that non-polar molecule will convert the polar molecule, but non-polar molecule will convert the polar molecule but is not a permanent, just acts as a polar molecule. Why? That non-polar molecule influenced by the polar molecule. For example, we take the magnetic, one iron rod. The magnetic is roughed on the, this is the iron and this is the magnitude. In చేస్తున్నాను that magnetic pole is roughed on the iron rod. That iron acts as magnetic, but it is not a magnetic. But it acts as a magnet. The same application apply in the polar and non-polar molecule. Here the polar molecule having the positive and negative charges, and the non-polar molecule will have no charges. But the non-polar molecule influenced by the polar molecule, it getting the partial positive and negative charges. Partial positive and negative charges. Partial positive and negative will get, and finally it acts as a polar molecule. This is called dipole induced dipole forces. Clear? Dipole induced dipole. So finally, what is the dipole induced dipole? Here the force of attraction between the polar and non-polar molecules is called dipole induced dipole forces. Okay. Here one involves one polar molecule and involves the one non-polar molecule. It involves one polar and one non-polar molecule. Here the polar molecule having the permanent dipole moment and the non-polar molecule will having the zero dipole moment. One polar molecule interact with the another polar molecule. One polar molecule interact with the another polar molecule. That non-polar molecule influenced by the polar molecule. That non-polar molecule will get in the partial positive and negative charges. It acts as a and it will convert to polar molecule but not permanently. So that is called dipole induced dipole. For example, polar molecule, take the polar molecule HCl and non-polar molecule is CH4. Okay. Here the HCl and CH4. Here HCl is the polar molecule and CH4 is the non-polar molecule. That non-polar molecule CH4 influenced by the polar molecule HCl, it acts as that CH4 acts as a polar molecule but not permanently. This is called dipole induced forces. Dipole induced dipole forces. Okay. Once again I will repeat it. So what is meant by intermolecular forces? What is meant by polar and non-polar and a dipole moment? What is a non-polar molecule? There is no charge of any atom in a molecule is called non-polar molecule. Polar molecule will have charge and dipole moment, the distance between the two charges is called dipole moment. It is denoted by the mu. And here the next one, intermolecular force. What is the intermolecular forces? The force of attraction and repulsions between the forces of attraction and repulsions between the molecules or atoms is called intermolecular forces. The attractive intermolecular forces is called van der Waals forces. And the types of the intermolecular forces: London forces, dipole forces, dipole induced dipole forces, ion dipole forces, ion induced dipoles. So these two topics tomorrow I will continue. Okay. So types of London forces. It is also called dispersion forces. What is the London forces? The intermolecular forces between the non-polar molecules. రెండు నాన్ పోలార్ మాలిక్యూల్స్ మధ్య ఉన్న ఇంటరాక్షన్ ఏమంటారంటే లండన్ ఫోర్సెస్ అంటారు. ఇట్ ఇంట్రడ్యూస్డ్ బై ది జర్మన్ ఫిజిసిస్ట్ లండన్, జర్మన్ సైంటిస్ట్ అయినటువంటి ఫిట్జ్ లండన్ ఇంట్రడ్యూస్డ్ బై ది లండన్ ఫోర్సెస్. సో ఇట్ ఈస్ కాల్డ్ లండన్ ఫోర్సెస్. ఇట్ ఈస్ ద వీక్ van der Waals forces, weak intermolecular forces. It forms the instantaneous dipoles. Why? How to form the instant dipole moments? If the two non-polar molecules interact with each other to form are like or acts dipole molecules. Just to form the instantaneous dipoles, but not a dipole. Acts as a instantaneous dipoles. An example, CH4. And the second one, dipole forces. What is meant by dipole forces? The intermolecular forces between the polar molecules. Rendu polar molecules mధ్య interactions ఏమంటారంటే dipole forces అంటారు. It form the permanent dipole moment. How to form the permanent dipole moment? The two polar molecules interact with each other. One molecule of the negative charge will attract the another molecule of the positive charge to form the dipole force, to form the permanent dipole moment. This charge separation between the two polar molecules is called permanent dipole moment. It is called dipole forces. For example, HCl. Okay nana, అర్థమవుతుంది అనుకుంటున్నాను. dipole forces. రెండు polar molecules మధ్య attraction జరిగితే that is called dipole forces. One polar molecule end of the negative, another polar molecule starting of the positive charge will attract to each other to form permanent dipole moment. It is called dipole forces. And third one, dipole induced dipole forces. Here the intermolecular forces between the polar and non-polar molecules is called dipole moment. Here the inverted polar molecule having the permanent dipole moment and a non-polar molecule zero dipole moment. Dipole moment is a zero. The dipole moment not equal to zero. It is a permanent dipole moment. It is a zero dipole moment. One polar molecule and a second one is a non-polar molecule will interact with each other. That non-polar molecule influenced by the polar molecule and the non-polar molecule having the getting charges partial positive and negative charges. And finally, that non-polar molecule will act as a polar molecule to form the dipole induced dipole forces. For example, if we take the cell under CH4. Okay, na? So this is intermolecular forces. Inka remaining two topics ఉన్నాయి. Tomorrow దాన్ని కంటిన్యూ చేస్తాను. So that is one is the London forces, dipole forces, dipole induced dipole forces, ion dipole forces, ion induced dipole forces. Tomorrow I will continue. Thank you, Nana.